All right, 131. We were talking about Unit 4. We were talking about Jefferson. We were talking about what was happening with Chapter 7 at this particular point. Here's what the issue is. Jefferson makes changes. One of those changes are the midnight judges. The midnight judges are important because we're going to test the Constitution. Um, what will happen is Madison's going to come in. He's going to refuse to fill some of the judgeships because he knows that Jefferson is trying to stack the judiciary against him. What will happen is one of those judges or judge appointees by the name of Marbury is going to bring an action, and this action will be to sue for his position. That's going to end up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, headed by one of actually Jefferson's cousins, is going to weigh this in. And this is important because what's going to happen is this cousin doesn't like Jefferson, doesn't care for him, is in fact one of those people who is much more about strict interpretation. And this is what happens is he's going to go ahead and they're going to weigh this and say, okay, well, listen, we would love to be able to decide whether or not he gets to be a judge because I think he should be. But legally, we can't look at this. We can't look at this because the Judiciary Act of 1801 is unconstitutional. So we're not going to give him the judgeship. We're going to find out that a law you made is unconstitutional and null and void, so you can't appoint judges to a position that can't exist. This is important because what this does is it gives the Supreme Court the power of judicial review. It allows them to keep the power because it's part of those implied powers that says, listen, we can decide what's constitutional and what's not, and we can help to change or actually interpret how things should be. What else do we need to know? Jefferson has some issues. He's going to run into what's called the Burr conspiracy. I won't talk much about that. I'll let you read about that because it's interesting that Aaron Burr, excuse me, among being vice president, among having killed Hamilton in a duel, also tried to go ahead and carve off a chunk of the whole Louisiana Purchase to create his very own country, and still yet we value him as a true American. Interesting stuff. Here's what the issue happens with Jefferson. Since he scales back this so much, he's going to run into a problem with Europe because the fight between France and Great Britain is going to cause us problem with shipping. And so while we are weak, what's going to happen is Madison will take over and they're going to run into some of the same problems. France doesn't want us to trade with England. England doesn't want us to trade with France. They're going to interfere with both of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to initiate the Embargo Act. The Embargo Act says we're not going to trade with either one of them as long as they're being mean to us. The other thing that will happen is Great Britain is going to start recruiting, and that's a loose word. What they're doing is impressing. They're going to be stopping American ships and what they deem as British waters, and they're going to start interviewing the crew. They're going to start to check, and they're going to determine that some of the crew members from these American ships are actually British sailors who at one point jumped ship, who went AWOL, and they're going to take them and put them back in the British Navy. They're going to impress them and force them, almost kind of slave labor kind of version of things, to go back and serve the crown. We don't like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a situation where we're going to talk about is, excuse me, our version is peaceable coercion. We're going to force the French, we're going to force the British to behave themselves. We can't do it with military might because we don't have a military. We quit funding any military. We don't have a standing army because we're a peaceful country. We depend on militia at this particular point to do what we need to do. And we don't have much of a navy. We don't have any army. And so peaceable coercion doesn't work. So we go with what's called the Non-Intercourse Act. Here's what happens. we're going to create laws that say we won't trade with you. And they could care less. They could care less, and so eventually what happens is we get involved in a war, in the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 is important because the British will go ahead and turn to the Native Americans. The British still have forts in the Ohio Valley. They still have forts along the Mississippi, and so they're going to go ahead and recruit Native Americans to fight back against us, against the Americans, and promise them they will give them their territory back. They will give them the land we took from them. When we start the War of 1812, it doesn't go well. Literally, the British will land in Washington, D.C., they will land in Baltimore. They will land in a couple other spots. I love the fact they land in Washington, D.C. in such a way that we're not prepared to repel them, and we're forced to evacuate the White House. And literally, the commander for the British Guard that invades will sit down and eat the president's dinner because that was still on the table when the president got chased out of the White House. We're not ready for a war. We're going to fight it. We're going to fight it against Tecumseh and the Native Americans. We're going to fight it against the British. We're going to go ahead and say, hey, you know what? We know that Canada's up here. They're being held in bondage. We're going to go up and save Canada. Turns out Canada doesn't want to be saved from Britain. They'd rather stay with Britain. We're going to start losing really fast because we're not equipped for this. Jefferson is going to realize he made some errors. Madison is going to realize that he made some errors. Eventually, we're going to start to fight back. We're going to find a couple of commanders who will do well in the Northeast and start to push back. We're going to find a couple of commanders, William Henry Harrison, in the Midwest and Ohio Valley is going to do well. We're going to find some guy named Andrew Jackson, who's going to do well in the Southeast. Commodore Perry is going to do well in the Great Lakes, enough that we're going to go ahead and push back. One of the epic highlights of this, it talks about Francis Scott Key and the Fort Mchenry. It talks about that's where we get, one of our great national songs at. Here's the situation. We negotiate an end to the War of 1812. We negotiate a war to the end of 1812. We don't win. We can't win. We don't have an army. We don't have a navy. We win because Great Britain is busy fighting with France. All right? We're not worth the trouble. They would rather trade with us than fight with us. We don't interfere with their trade. We don't interfere with their shipping. We're not really competing with them. We have lots of natural resources they'd rather have. It's not worth their while to stage a long-range war, which is what this is. And so they're willing to go ahead and negotiate out of it. Okay? That's really what the Treaty of Ghent is that they're negotiating a close to the war. We would have not done well, and this to me, this is Revolutionary War Part 2. All right? This is finally going to get the British out of America. It will get to the French largely out of America. It gives us a more comfortable standing in such a way that we come out of it okay. Problem is, we have a little bit of an economic crisis, but because we had to cut off trade, it forced us to manufacture. It forced us to create industry. It forced us to become more self-reliant in such a way that we have a blooming of brand new factories. We have a booming of brand new businesses. We have a shift in the economy that once we cover from the immediate economic damage, we're actually on better footing. And that's a huge part of what's going on at this particular point. You'll find out this is also the introduction of Andrew Jackson, the commander-in-chief, the general at this particular point. This is where he's going to gain his fame and eventually gain his way into the White House, is the setting here. All right, I'm going to leave you off. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the next chapter up.